not sure this is on. Is this on? I don't think so. Okay. Who was here yesterday? So pretty much everybody. Just to kind of refresh our memory, the premise of this weekend's retreat is that this idea of redeeming time. There we go. So the premise of this weekend's retreat is that redeeming time is something we can do not only with regard to the present, but we can also redeem time in the past and in the future of our lives. And yesterday we did spend a bit of time talking about the present moment. Today we're going to jump into the future and talk about redeeming time in the future. And then in the second session we'll jump back to the past. And you might wonder why I put the future first, because it's, out of time, out of the order. But the reason is because in my experience, and I've been writing on time, researching on time for quite a while, and my experience is that on a spiritual level, people tend to have more struggles with the past, things that have happened in the past, regrets they have towards the past. They tend to struggle more with that than with regard to the future, because the future, there's always this feeling that you can change things in the future, but when you think about the past, you don't have that same sense that you can change things. And so I wanted to save the hardest for last, so that maybe we can spend just a bit more time on the past than on the future. So redeeming the future, despondency and the fear of death. And despondency, remember, is, as I see it at least, the spiritual sickness that causes a hatred of the present and a temptation to flee from the present into either the past or the future. So, the guiding questions of this morning's session are how does spiritual sickness affect our view of the future? What are some of the passions, what are some of the thoughts that come up to affect our view of the future? How is our fear of death at the root of this? And how can we begin to redeem the future with God's help? So first question, how does spiritual sickness affect our view of the future? In despondency, we try to flee from the present moment into our own versions of the past or the future. So this is review from yesterday. And if you remember yesterday, I had a slide which had the kind of person standing at a crossroads. And he could either go off into the future or go off into the past or stay the course in the present moment. And on each side, I had kind of a list of thought patterns or passions that are sort of traditional spiritual struggles, but we don't often realize that they are generally centered on our view of either the past or the future. And so some of the struggles that I listed for the future were worry and anxiety, worry and anxiety are always about what's to come. They're about things that haven't happened. And we don't always recognize that, because when we feel anxious or when we have worries, they seem so real that it's almost as though those things have already happened. Or we feel maybe our present circumstances are such that we can't possibly imagine things going any differently than our worst fears. And in that sense, it's almost as though our worst fears have already taken place. But that aside, they're always about things that haven't happened yet. So that's one struggle. Another struggle is avarice or greed. And you might be thinking, well, how is that future oriented? And I'll give you a bigger explanation of that from Evagrius in a second. Another struggle we have with regard to the future is fear. And I would say at the root of almost all our fears in life is the fear of death. Again, we'll talk a bit more about that as the presentation goes on. Vainglory is another passion we struggle with regards to the future. Selfish ambition, wanting to make a name for ourselves or find success for ourselves in the future. Finally, hopelessness. Hopelessness is a huge struggle when it comes to the future. Now, if you remember that slide from yesterday, same one with the crossroads, on one column, with the future column, I had hopelessness at the bottom. And in the past column, I had forgetfulness at the bottom. Specifically forgetfulness of God's acts, God's redemption. And I see those two things as going together. When hopelessness is kind of a forgetfulness, but towards the future. In hopelessness, we kind of forget that God is capable of redeeming us, that repentance is a viable path back to God. And it goes hand in hand with forgetfulness, because so often hopelessness starts when we forget what God has done in the past. So we may forget times when maybe just on a personal, individual level, God has helped us, or God has done something good in our lives. Or maybe we forget more on a global level. We forget the resurrection. We forget that Christ has actually entered this world in the flesh, trampled down death, redeeming the human condition and pointing the way for humanity to go back to God. Now, we don't necessarily forget that on a rational level. If I were to ask you, did Christ ever come? Or, do you believe that Christ came? You would probably say yes. But what I mean is more on an interior level or existential level. We live our lives often as though we've forgotten Christ has come. And that forgetfulness often fuels hopelessness in the future. Because if we have no sense that God has been here, that God is here, how are we supposed to have hope that God is going to be here in the future? It's really interesting if you read the Psalms. There's so many Psalms where David writes, remember the acts of old. And he'll then go on to list a bunch of salvific acts in history. Remember God who led you out of Egypt. Remember God who led you through the sea and trampled your oppressors. Remember God who led you to the promised land after your years of wandering in the desert. And then he'll have a line where it will say, therefore, something like, therefore take heart, for I will yet praise him, or do not fear. Or so often the Psalms are structured along this kind of like remembering God in the past so that you can strengthen hope for the future. And I think that as Christians, we can sort of use that as a model to build our hope. There's not a lot of hope in our world today, and just even in our general culture, but even sometimes in the church. And sometimes we need to really actively sort of remember what God has done in the past, to remind ourselves that he's still active and he will continue to act in the future. So that's just a little bit of, a side note on hopelessness. I want to kind of focus in on a few of these, just to give you maybe a clear idea of how these struggles, which I would say most of us face at some point or another, how these struggles actually relate to the future. So let's look first at selfish ambition, or the more antiquated term, vainglory. And this is a quote once again from Evagrius in his practical treatise for monastics. And he's writing about, it's at a point in the text where he's explaining all of these different passions and what they really consist of, how to recognize them, that kind of thing. And he's not saying that this is, all about the future. This is just my interpretation of Evagrius, just to be clear. But here's what he says about selfish ambition. And he's describing sort of the link between selfish ambition and despondency. He writes, despondency drives the monk to desire other sites where he can more easily procure life's necessities, more readily find work, and make a real success of himself. So that thought or desire to make a real success of himself, that's vainglory. That's the same thing as selfish ambition. So basically what he's saying is, in despondency, in this sort of present moment sickness, the monk, he's still sitting in his cell. He hasn't changed his life at all, but he's still sitting in his cell, and he's thinking just through all of these possibilities. Like, well, if I left, if I left the monastic life, I could go and find somewhere else where I could really be successful. And as long as I weren't in this cell is what's holding me back. And if I could just get out of here and get out of this lifestyle, then I could be, famous or successful and have enough money to live. So what's interesting here is that just as I've been saying, this hatred of the present, hatred of the cell, drives the monk to these kind of fantasies, very sort of prideful and ambitious fantasies of the future. Now, you could argue, could play devil's advocate, and say, well, is it really such a bad thing to have ambitions for ourselves? Is it really such a bad thing to want to be successful and to want to be able to even just provide for ourselves or provide for our family? And I would have to say, no. It took a lot of ambition for me, at least, to be able to get my PhD and to do some of the other things. And I think that ambitions aren't necessarily a bad thing. But what's sort of destructive in what Evagrius is pointing out is that it's driven by a kind of ingratitude or lack of thanksgiving. It's driven by a kind of, I keep using this term, antipathy, but a sort of hatred for what God has given you. And I think even when you're, it's, maybe there are times where, let's say your job isn't providing you with a high enough income to make ends meet or something, and you legitimately have to start considering better options or more lucrative options if you're gonna even just survive and be able to afford food. So there are times in life where we do have to start making ambitions and maybe thinking about a better path for ourselves. But you can do that without lacking thanksgiving. You can do that in sort of a mode that's not dependent on hating or scorning what God has given you. And here, what Evagrius is addressing is he's particularly addressing monastics who have taken a vow to remain in the desert. They've taken a vow to live their lives as ascetics, basically dead to the world. And so really what this desire to make a success of oneself for a monk, that would require no longer being a monk. To leave his cell, to leave the monastery, to make a success of himself would require going back on really his principles, his values, and the vow that he's taken for himself. And I'm not saying sometimes in life we do change our mind and all of that, but that's another thing to consider. As a Christian and as an Orthodox Christian in our lives, we too have taken some vows. Maybe many of us have been chrismated, but on a deeper level, we've taken a vow of sorts to follow Christ, whatever the cost, whatever the cross is that's involved. And sometimes there's a real temptation to sort of throw that off in order to find success, maybe not worldly success, but just find something more pleasant for ourselves. Because let's face it, it's not always easy to be a Christian. It's not always pleasant to be a Christian. And sometimes there are paths in life that are just legitimately easier and maybe even more attractive at times. Marriage is another kind of vow we take. Having children and caring for them is another kind of vow we take. And there's all sorts of, our lives, just the relational fabric of our lives, we're kind of hemmed into certain relationships. And maybe we never signed a contract to be in those relationships. I certainly never signed a contract to have the parents that I have, but I have them. And so I have a kind of duty to them, even if I didn't ask to be placed in that relationship. And it's those things we want to be careful of whenever we feel the temptation to leave our cell in search of something better. What are the principles, what are the values that I'm walking away from? And there's even sometimes ethical considerations. I think we really have to be careful, especially in our culture, where we have so many opportunities to fall into sin, that we don't neglect the things that we've already sort of committed to in our lives, the holy things that we've committed to in our lives, in search of success or just more pleasant circumstances. So that's selfish ambition. Let's talk a little bit about greed. Now, it's hard to think about ourselves as greedy. And I think if most of us were to ask ourselves, our first thought would be, well, I'm not greedy. I give to the church, or I give to my kids. I give to a homeless person on the street when I see them. But the thing about greed is it's often a lot more deeply rooted than kind of these externals. And I would say that most of us living in, the 21st century North American culture probably struggle with greed, because our whole ethos in our culture is to get more. If you think about my own spiritual father, Father Stephen Kostoff in Cincinnati, he recently published a book of his meditations. He's been writing email and blog meditations since the internet existed. And he pulled the best ones and put them into a book. And one of them is a meditation for, I think, Black Friday. And he talks about, in there, he mentions, why don't we ever hear on the news, oh, the economy grew this quarter by 1%, thanks be to God, or something. Instead, we always hear it's never growing enough. No one, after Black Friday, you get those reports on the news back of how much money was spent. It's never enough. And the whole basis of a capitalist economy, or post-capitalist economy, is it can't ever stay the same. The economy, in order to function, always has to be growing. And that boils down into, I think, our own mentalities. If we're in a place in life where we have enough to eat, we have money to live, we're almost wired nowadays to feel like that's not enough. It's not enough unless we're gaining. My generation is going to be the first generation, supposedly, that probably won't make more than their parents made. Up until our parents, generations have been making more and more and more since the Second World War. And people hear that and think, oh, that's really bad. But I would say we're still doing pretty good when you compare what my generation has to most of the rest of the world. We're still okay. We're still okay. And maybe it's kind of a myth that each generation needs to surpass their parents in financial and economic terms. I don't think that's realistic in the long term. So anyway, back to greed. Here's another quote from Evagrius, and he's talking about this avarice, which is, again, just this greed for wealth. He writes that avarice suggests to the mind a lengthy old age, an inability to perform manual labor at some future date, famines that are sure to come, sickness that will visit us, the pinch of poverty, the great shame that comes from accepting the necessities of life from others. So here what's really interesting, and we don't often think of this, is that what drives greed, according to Evagrius, is anxiety about the future. And it's not just an anxiety of, I'm not going to have enough money to eat or something in the future. It's an anxiety about what's going to happen to my body in the future. Am I going to have the ability to care for myself in the future? What's going to happen to nature and the environment in the future? Are there going to be famines that are going to make it impossible for me to raise crops? Very sort of apropos for our time with all the talk of global warming. Am I going to be sick? Am I going to be poor? Am I going to need to rely on others in the future, whether for bodily needs, for care, for finances, for food? And out of this sort of anxiety, we become greedy, and we start to imagine that if we just stored up enough wealth, resource, then no matter what comes, we'll be invincible. It reminds me a lot of the parable of the rich fool. And I'm going to read that for us just to refresh our memory. It's from the Gospel of Luke, and this is in the New Revised Standard Version. Someone in the crowd said to Jesus, "Teacher, tell my brother to divide the family inheritance with me." But he said to him, "Friend, who set me to be a judge or arbitrator over you?" And he said to them, "Take care, be on your guard against all kinds of greed, for one's life does not consist in the abundance of possessions." Then he told them a parable. The land of a rich man produced abundantly, and he thought to himself, "What should I do? For I have no place to store my crops." Then he said, "I'll do this. I'll pull down my barns and build larger ones, and there I will store all my grain and my goods. And I will say to my soul, 'Soul, you have ample goods laid up for many years. Relax, eat, drink, be merry.' But God said to him, 'You fool, this very night your life is being demanded of you. And the things you have prepared, whose will they be? So it is with those who store up treasures for themselves, but are not rich towards God.'" So what's happening in this parable is that this person has so much wealth that he doesn't even have enough room to store it. So he has to take down the barns he has and build bigger ones to store everything so that his crops don't go to rot. And he uses this as kind of an insurance for himself. "Oh, finally I have these big barns and they're completely full. Now I don't have to worry about anything. I don't have to worry about anything in the present. I don't have to worry about anything in the future. I can just relax, eat, drink, be merry, live my life, come what may." Well, the problem is he dies that same day. And that those crops didn't buy him any extra time. And the point here is kind of that, what's he now going to do in eternity? Those crops are no good for eternity. They're not going to help him at all when he passes out of this life. But this more implicit lesson is, what good could those have crops even done had he lived longer? Like, crops only last so long, no matter what kind of barn you have. My grandparents were farmers, and it doesn't matter like how good or climate controlled your barn is. They only last so long. And milk only lasts so long, and wealth only lasts so long. And there's only so much that even money can do. Okay? Money can't buy you protection in old age. It can't stop you from getting cancer. It can't stop you from needing other people. So I think that this is something we need to think about. How are our anxieties towards, first of all, what are our anxieties? Because I think we all have a different kind of collection of specific worries with regard to how things are going to go in the future. But second of all, what is the role, how are those anxieties shaping our greed in the present? Evagrius has another thought about greed from a different treatise that he wrote. And he said, "Even if death should approach, the monk with many possessions cannot take his eye away from material things." And his point there was that the more possessions you have and the more surety you try to store up for yourself in this life, it sort of fixes your gaze on the material. And even in death, even in those last moments, it becomes very difficult for you to let go. And those last moments of life are very important. Hopefully we're able to be in a kind of presence of mind where we can say goodbye to our lives and reach out to God and pray and all of that. But if your mind is even a little bit distracted by are they gonna fight about my will, or are they gonna what's going to happen to my possessions? If we're even a little bit distracted by that in those last moments, something is wrong, and that's a huge, a huge thing we need to be on our guard from. And just a kind of anecdote, my husband and I, this past fall, we bought a new car, like a brand new car, and it's not ever something I thought I would do, but there was like a deal on the interest rates and all of that, because we needed a car. And we were shopping around thinking we'd go used, and then the interest rates dropped and all of that. So we ended up buying new because it was a bit more affordable. And I told my husband, as soon as we were sitting in the dealership in the car, about to drive, about to turn it on and drive it off the lot. And they always say, when you buy a new car and you drive it off the lot, it depreciates whatever percentage, and you lose all that money. And I told my husband this. I'm like, as we drive it off the lot, we're losing money. And, we kind of laughed about it. But it's amazing when you buy something like that. It sort of shifts your mind, and you find yourself all of a sudden worrying about it. It would be parked somewhere, and in the back of my mind I'd be thinking, I hope someone's not scratching it. I hope someone, if I'm at the grocery store, I hope someone doesn't pull up too close and open their door against our door. All of these thoughts I never had before, because when we had used cars, I could care less if, if they get scratched or whatever. But then you have a new car and it's pristine, and every little scratch or dent is noticeable, right? And it made me kind of realize, wow, there really is something to be said for kind of minimizing your need for possessions. So we still haven't gotten a dent yet. So we'll see. Okay, so as you can see, once we start talking about greed and this kind of anxiety towards the future, we really start getting into the fear of death. The fear of death. Because at the heart of all these anxieties, well, what's going to be happening with my body in 20 years? What's going to be happening with the environment in 20 years? What's at the heart of all of these is, what's death going to be like? What's death going to be like for me? This great mystery. There's a quote by a novelist that I really like. His name is Philip. Well, I don't like his novels, but I like the quote, Philip Roth. And he wrote something along the lines of, in every calm and reasonable person, there's another person, sort of secret person, scared witless about death. And I think that's most of us on some level. No matter how spiritually mature we get, death is always this great mystery that none of us in this room, if you're still alive, have ever fully endured before. Maybe we've been in the room as someone else has died, but we ourselves have never faced that. And until we do, it will always be something kind of looming on the horizon that we're not really sure how to feel about. And I think that at the heart of despondency and at the heart of this antipathy towards the present moment is this fear of death. Because what we don't like about the present moment is we can't control it. I couldn't control who would come to this retreat. I can't control whether my back is gonna hurt right now. I can't, and those are just the little things. On a much bigger level, there's so much in this moment that I can't control. I can't control whether I'm going to have a job when I come back, because even though my boss really likes me, there are things outside of his control. There are economic factors outside of his control. So there's so much about the present that's unknown. And the biggest unknown of, what that does is it sort of reminds us of the biggest unknown of all, which is death. And trying to maneuver our way back to the past or maneuver our way into the future is our mind's way of asserting control over a situation we fundamentally have no control over, which is life in general. So it's kind of our way of tricking ourselves into believing we have control, tricking ourselves into believing we'll live forever. And we can go our whole lives without really ever thinking about or facing death or remembering death. There's a quote from my book where I try to kind of describe how this has felt for me. And I wrote that for most of my life, and I'm someone who's been afraid of death since the beginning. I've been thinking about death for a long time. For most of my life, I had no word for that strange fusion of sadness, restlessness, and distraction that sprang up whenever the awareness of life's brevity became too overwhelming. The sting of death's reality dulled into mindless avoidance, a way of living that flits from one distraction or aimless worry to the next. And I'll use a kind of contemporary anecdote. One of my big struggles, it hasn't always been a struggle, but definitely the last year or so, is like scrolling through social media at night when I'm like laying in bed. I don't know why. I never used to like bring my smartphone into my bedroom, but now I use it as an alarm clock and all that, so it's there. And it becomes so easy to just tune out and scroll and scroll and scroll. And before I know it, it's late. I have now like lost an hour of sleep, but I'm so compelled. It's almost like a compulsion. I have to see what other people are up to. I have to sort of distract myself from just shutting the light off and going to bed. And in the church, we've always understood sleep as a metaphor for death. And at night, that act of just intentionally, turning the lights off, saying our prayers, and calmly going to bed is, on a metaphorical level, we believe that's a way of preparing ourselves for death. In fact, many of the nighttime or bedtime prayers in the Orthodox Church explicitly talk about death. And I know for myself, it's like one part of my brain is like, turn the smartphone off. Turn the smartphone off. We need to go to sleep. And the other part of my brain is like, no, I'm not. I'm going to keep scrolling. It's not meaningful at all. I hate doing it. I'm not even reading anything interesting, but I'm going to keep doing it. And that part of my brain, I think, is like, what's really there is I don't like saying goodbye. I don't like turning things off. And at the same time, I think that just doing that simple act of turning the smartphone off is like a way to say, I'm going to die someday, and someday I'm going to have to say goodbye to everybody and this whole life. And am I going to do that calmly? Am I going to do that prayerfully? Or is it going to be this huge, almost schizophrenic struggle where one part of my brain is yelling at me to, shut it off, say goodbye, and the other part of my brain is putting up this huge fight? Well, I hope on my deathbed it's the former. I hope I can be calm, and I hope I can be sane. And so maybe we need to think about these nighttime, struggles with the smartphone as just, this is our opportunity to learn how to die in a very small way on a daily basis. There's a quote here from Richard Beck, who's a theologian and a psychologist, and he has a book called The Slavery of Death. He wrote that prior to the Industrial Revolution and the advent of modern medicine, our experience of death was more direct and immediate. Death was a daily reality. People were dying more often at home. You would probably, even by the time you make it through childhood, already see the deaths of close family members up close. And I kind of skipped over part of his passage here, but in this area, this ... area, he goes on to sort of give a historical summary of what's happened with regard to death in the modern society, which is that we've put it behind closed doors. We've ushered it off to nursing homes. We've ushered it off to hospitals. And as a result, very few of us, certainly younger people in my generation and younger, have actually maybe not even seen a dead body, even in the context of a funeral, but many, even fewer people have actually been in the room as somebody has died. And so death is even more of a mystery for us. And he continues that in an attempt to manage or reduce our anxiety, we're driven to embrace distractions, entertainments, and comforts. The illusion of a deathless society can only be maintained by a vast industry of such distractions and entertainments. So he believes that our whole, we always say, our society is so full of distraction and stress and all that. And he believes that all of that is kind of this artifice engineered to mask and fool us into this illusion of deathless existence, which is really, really powerful, I think, to consider. So let's talk about despondency and the fear of death. Despondency is one of many reactions to the fear and reality of death. And I've already kind of talked about this hatred of the present, confronts us with what's out of our control. One thing I think we should think about is whether despondency is a sin or a sickness or a perfectly rational coping mechanism. So if you know what a coping mechanism is in psychological terms, a coping mechanism is something, a strategy that the mind enacts to be able to function alongside a difficult reality. And sometimes coping mechanisms may, usually coping mechanisms are good to a certain point, because I've just said it allows us to function, but they tend to go towards extremes. So kind of the task of like mental health is being able to recognize your own personal coping mechanisms and make sure you keep them in moderation. But my point here is that if you take resurrection out of the picture, if you take Christ out of the picture, I think despondency is actually the sane option. Without Christ and the resurrection, there is no hope in the face of death. I should say, no lasting hope. I think there's, people can face death more calmly than others, even without Christ. But what I mean is there's no hope in an eternal sense. There's no hope of death being conquered in the end. There's no hope that this really means anything in the end. And even other world religions may be able to offer some comfort in the face of death. But they can't say that, how do I put this? What other religions can't say is that death, this specter that has haunted humanity since the beginning, is actually death itself is actually meaningful, and death itself is actually a gateway to something better. No other religion can really offer that. They can offer comfort sort of despite death, if that makes any sense. There's a verse in 1 Corinthians where St. Paul says, "If Christ is not risen, then our preaching is empty, and your faith is also empty." Those are pretty sobering words. I think maybe to a lesser extent in the Orthodox Church, but certainly all of us are guilty of this at some point. There's a tendency to turn Christianity into a sort of therapeutic system for getting through life. Well, you hear these studies that come out every so often where prayer, they'll say like, prayer helps you be happier or something, or prayer has this sort of effect on the brain chemistry. And so, so it turns out prayer is a good thing because it makes us feel better. No, prayer is a good thing because it connects us to Christ and allows us to enter into this deeper relationship to Him that is going to see us through death into new life. That's why prayer is a good thing. I don't feel good after praying a lot of the time. I still pray, or at least try to. But we turn Christianity into this system where it's the transactional system. We do the things so that we derive some kind of good feeling or good benefit from them. And it becomes this sort of self-enclosed, this worldly system. And we forget that the whole point is death. The whole point is learning to take up your cross. The whole point is the resurrection, regardless of how it feels along the way. So what St. Paul is saying here is, if we don't believe that Christ is risen, there's no point to any of this. There's other things in life you can do to make you feel good. This verb is, if Christ is not risen, is interesting. Depending on the translation that you look at, the tense of this verb will be translated in all sorts of different ways. So remember, the tense of a verb tells you what time this action is taking place in. So there's past tense, there's future tense. And in this translation, it's in the present tense. The reason, but you can find translations that'll say, if Christ has not been risen. And I asked my husband, my Greek is not the greatest, but my husband helps me a lot when I'm looking at Greek texts. And he was telling me that this is kind of, the tense of this verb has more of it implies more of a continuous action. So it's about an event that's taken place in the past, but one that has continuous action. And one other way that you could translate this is if Christ is not being raised, implying this idea that Christ is continuously being raised. And he's continuously being raised because the resurrection was both a historical event, but also an event that continues for all of reality. And every time we proclaim the resurrection, we almost reenact it or reactualize, becomes present in our midst. So, in other words, what we're preaching is not just this once and done resurrection. We're preaching the fact that the resurrection is good for all of time. That the resurrection, Christ continues to be raised, and with us and raises us with him, even though we live 2,000 years after his resurrection. Redeeming the future. So these struggles that tend to problematize our relationship to the future, how can we begin to cultivate sort of new thought patterns, redemptive thought patterns that can counter them? I think there are a few virtues. I put 3 here, and then I put 4 bullet points. But so four virtues that can lead us back to the present when we're preoccupied with the future. Or in other words, virtues that can help us redeem our attitude towards the future. The first is, of course, patience, which is easier said than done. But patience because we don't know what's going to happen in the future. And maybe we have sort of we have some good dreams or fantasies about the future, and we wish the future would come sooner rather than later. But we have to learn to be patient. For me, one thing that really helps with patience is the Jesus prayer, just being able to say the Jesus prayer in the present and remind myself, this is actually where I'm at. I have no idea what's going to come to pass in the future, but this is where I'm at. And I may want the future to come more quickly. I may want people in my life to sort of shape up more quickly than they appear to be. But I have no control over that, and I'm not called to have any control over that. That's other people's free will, and that's God's grace. But what I can do in the present is pray and stay rooted in Christ. Another virtue to practice is freedom from possessions. And Evagrius, as well as a lot of monastic theologians, talk about this a lot, because in the monastic lifestyle, they weren't supposed to have a lot of possessions. In fact, that's kind of common sense. Well, yeah, they're monks, they're not supposed to own things, they're not supposed to have property. But you can see from Evagrius's writing that it was still a temptation to acquire possessions. One thing in particular is that many monks would acquire a servant, usually like a younger, like a servant boy who may also have been kind of informally training as a new monk, but they would depend on these servants to do some of the more menial tasks of living, which in those days there were a lot because they didn't have conveniences. Especially being in the middle of a desert. And Evagrius explicitly, forbade or told people not to enlist the help of a servant. Like if you're a monk, you should be doing these tasks yourself. Manual labor is not something to be shunned. And he would also caution against, like if people would bring gifts, he would caution against keeping them. Instead, he thought monks should, as soon as the guest leaves who's given you this gift, give the gift to the poor, or use it only when someone comes over, another guest comes over, serve them that, whatever it was, honey or whatever, and don't have any for yourself. And I think today this is something a lot of people are starting to realize, that having too many possessions does more harm than good. It maybe on the outside seems convenient, but becomes problematic. And on Netflix, at least in Canada, probably here, the big show right now to watch is Marie Kondo's documentary, where she helps people throw more things away. And her big question is, does this object spark joy for you? And if it does, keep it. But if it doesn't, throw it away. And she has this highly regimented system of how you fold things and how you organize things, so that you can walk into your house and it's almost like you don't have anything at all, because the countertops are clear, the bookshelves are clear, there's no clutter. It's all been, perfectly organized into this very minimalistic way of living. Now, maybe that's a starting point. Maybe that's a starting point to have this conversation about letting go of possessions. But I think the real problem is our deeper relationship to stuff, and the fact that we kind of acquire these things to begin with. I've gone through times when I've purged things and said I'm going to be more minimal, and then it feels like there's kind of this void, like I need to go out and get more decorations, or I need to go out and sort of fill this void again. And it's that energy of needing things that I think we have to start thinking more about. Remembrance of death. I have another quote coming up, but we talked about this a bit yesterday in the thought exercise at the very end of the presentation, where you're sitting in your cell and acknowledging the suffering that it takes to sit in your cell, and then looking at your body and looking at the signs of death that are already evidenced in your body, wrinkles or what have you. And I think that act of remembering death, being able to remember that you yourself will one day die, and moreover, that death is already at work within you in a biological sense, that can actually help calm the fear of death. And there have actually been studies that have been done. I just got done teaching a course, or co-teaching a course at our School of Theological Studies in Toronto. And the course was about death in Orthodox tradition. And the Orthodox tradition is replete with, countless saints who call us to remember death on a daily basis. You can do this before bed during the bedtime prayers, or throughout your day, just remembering, I'm going to die. Dr. Al Rossi, if you've ever listened to him, Orthodox psychologist, author, ancient faith podcaster, his wife died rather young of cancer. And she has a tombstone, and they have now a grave plot where he will be buried. And he talked pretty openly on his podcast about the fact that he regularly goes to that grave plot and just stares at the grass and remembers, I will be there someday. This is the same ground I will lay in when I die. Now, to a broader culture, that can sound kind of morbid, but when you can sort of invite death into your life in a way that almost becomes a way of life, it can actually become death stops being something that you have to be paranoid about. It's never going to be a comfortable reality, and that's okay. But it starts to become a bit more familiar, and you don't have to have this feeling that you're constantly running away from it. And then finally, I've mentioned Thanksgiving as something that can help redeem our attitude towards the future, because to give thanks, we have to take a step back from the future and remember where we're actually at. One of the things that I do is I have a journal. Like someone told me to, years back, before you go to bed, think of 2 or 3 things. Give thanks to God for 2 or 3 things in your life, like concrete things. And I tried that, but it never, I would either fall asleep, or it just it didn't really seem to help me at all. And so then what I started doing instead is writing these things down in my journal, or even on my calendar, like my day planner. I'll just write these in the margins. And that was very helpful for me, because something about the act of writing it down makes these things more concrete. And then later, let's say I'm going through a season where I'm anxious, like, is God ever going to help me with this? Is this situation ever going to get better in the future? I can go back and read over, years of things I've given thanks for, just little things. And that helps me remember, you know what? God has given me an awful lot. And God has been present in my life in some really tiny ways and some really big ways. And I'm sure that He will maybe not answer my prayers, but I'm sure that He is good, and He will be with me, whatever happens in the future. And that helps me sort of calm down. I want to conclude with just kind of a thought exercise. And I think that, I guess the reason I like this quotation, so I'll read the quotation first, and then I'll explain why I think it's relevant to the things we've been talking about, and then we'll conclude for questions. But the quote reads, "Our holy and most ascetic master," this is probably Saint Macarius of Egypt, because that was Evagrius' teacher. "Our holy and most ascetic master stated that the monk should always live as if he were to die on the morrow, but at the same time that he should treat his body as if he were to live on with it for many years to come." So it's this tension. Live your life as if you're going to die tomorrow, but treat your body as though you will live a long time. And he's particularly talking about I mentioned this yesterday, a temptation he frequently have to overdo it when it comes to fasting, and then he would sort of treat his body really poorly with fasting, and then have all of these health conditions. That's a part of Evagrius' life. So he's saying, in prayer, live as though you're going to die tomorrow, but don't be so harsh on your body that you develop all of these health conditions that you then have to live with for the rest of your life. Treat your body kindly as though you're going to live for a long time, because that's the only body you're going to get. And I like this quote because it points out the tension when we start thinking, you hear this quote, live as though you'll die tomorrow, then your mind starts going to all of these really extreme places. Okay, well, what would I do if I'm going to die tomorrow? Well, I'm not going to talk to this person anymore because they really tick me off, and I don't want to waste my time talking to them. And I'm going to travel more, and I'm going to stop doing all of the things that frustrate me. And, well, obviously you may not actually die tomorrow, so be careful on all the people you say goodbye to and all of the trips that you plan in your head. What I think is the healthier, balance to this is in your prayers, pray as though you're going to die tomorrow, which helps you be more repentant. It helps foster that repentance and forgiveness. If you're going to die tomorrow, you have to work every day of kind of clearing your slate. But on the other hand, don't neglect the things that have to be done, the bills that have to be paid, the body that you're going to be living with your whole life, however long that may last. So do sort of what needs to be done. Foster the relationships that need fostering. Be kind to people as though you're going to continue living with them your whole life. And I think that by bringing these two things together, we sort of start to find a balance, not only with regard to our attitudes towards the future in general, but specifically with regard to the role that the fear of death plays in our anxieties. So with that, I'll conclude, and we'll take a break are we doing questions now or at the end of the session? We can do a few.